Hey all, welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon, author, journalist, recent congressional candidate, and I'm honored to be joined on the eve of Donald Trump's re-inauguration by Anne Applebaum. Anne, as you know, is a staff writer for The Atlantic. She's an esteemed author and historian who has written books like The Twilight of Democracy and Histories of the Soviet Union. She is one of those historians who's able to use the past to see into the future, and someone who has a unique perspective on that fight between democracy and autocracy that is the defining fight of our times. And it's an honor to speak with you always. I always get a lot out of it. But I wonder at this particular moment, looking back upon one of your more recent tomes, The Twilight of Democracy, whether you feel that's what we're facing. Are we facing the twilight of democracy first?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to say that nothing is ever preordained and nothing is ever inevitable. And everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we do today. So there is no rule of history that says democracy has to end or the United States has to become more repressive. There will always be people pushing back. Unexpected things will happen. I think the next couple of years, there will be a lot of chaos. And so there's nothing inevitable, but there is no denying that we now are about to have a president who did try to overturn the results of the 2020 election, who will probably seek to rewrite the history of that election and of what happened afterwards of January the 6th. So we'll be dealing with a phenomenon most Americans, modern contemporary Americans, aren't familiar with, which is the federal government creating false history and then trying to get people to go along with it. We have also a president who's said, I mean, I'm not, putting words in his mouth, who has said he would like to use the arms of the federal government, the Department of Justice, the FBI, to go after his enemies, not because they've committed crimes, but because he doesn't like them. He's spoken openly, and others around him have also spoken openly of using the federal government to attack media and other kinds of institutions that he finds troublesome or bothersome. And he's somebody who instinctively wants to rule with no obstacles and no checks and balances, no opponents in Congress, without having to create the coalitions that are usually the basis of an American presidency. And all those things are warning signs. And so I think it's important to begin to think about how we're going to live in this new period.
Well, as you say, he is pursuing a broad sort of autocratic inclined playbook. He praised Viktor Orban repeatedly over the course of the campaign, something that didn't get much attention despite the nakedness of it. That said, there's a reverse playbook that societies and citizens have used to push back on the attempts of autocrats to sort of capture a democracy. Some people have a lot of faith in our institutions. But ultimately, those are about individuals stepping up. What are some of the key playbooks that you've seen citizens effectively use to push back on these sort of impulses from an executive?
It's hard to talk about playbooks exactly. I mean, so there's a difference between, the U.S. or even, for example, Poland when we had an authoritarian populist government. There will be courts, there will be lawsuits, there will be members of Congress, there's open politics. I mean, we're not Venezuela, we're not Russia. There are going to be plenty of ways for citizens to contribute and for people to push back. You can support opposition politicians, you can contribute to their campaigns, you can work on their behalf, you can look for and read real news that's based on some kind of journalism, meaning it's written by people who've gone out and looked for information and then sought to verify it in different ways. You can choose to read that instead of reading propaganda or listening to propaganda. A lot of which is going to come from the government and come from, and media figures close to the government. So there are plenty of ways you can go on being a citizen in the normal ways that Americans have been citizens. I mean, there are no we're not at the stage of, it's not the Soviet Union where we have to have a kind of internal migration where people, whisper around the kitchen table and they don't have to say things out loud. But I do think people should probably be prepared for particularly people who are publicly prominent, for paying a higher price, speaking out or criticizing, or using the law in a way that the administration finds frustrating, could mean that you're the focus of a Twitter harassment project, or your organization or institution is in trouble. I mean, there could be, there are more consequences that people have to think about. I think the main thing is for people to work together to find allies. You and I were talking just before we started this formal podcast about the alliances of left and right, the far left and the far right, now coming together in a lot of ways in different formations. This is also clearly a moment. I mean, I think we know it already, but if you didn't know it already, now is the time for the center left and the center right to work together. People who maybe you were on the opposite side of, when the argument was about levels of taxation or healthcare or something else, these are now your friends. Yes. And make sure you have new allies and that you're surrounded by allies. Make sure you have friends around you who can support you if you want to be involved in politics or in political arguments. Certainly, one of the lessons from Poland, this is actually where I am now, and as I said, we had 8 years of an autocratic populist regime. It was actually a little bit less toxic than what we could have in the United States, because its leadership didn't control the levers of the internet in the way that the current administration might be able to do. I mean, we'll see. That's still to be determined. One of the ways in which they were finally beaten was through a lot of public participation, people who hadn't voted before coming out to vote, long-term campaigns run by civil society groups, kind of pro-democracy groups on the ground in a lot of places. I went, before the last Polish election, I went and spoke to a group that was just an ordinary, in a small town in central Poland, where a local, sort of wealthy local person had created a kind of democracy club or civil society club. And he would just invite people to come and speak, and they would do various activities together. And it was a very ordinary thing, but it was impressive in that it wasn't Warsaw. It wasn't a big city. There were nothing especially active about politics there in the past, but it was just a local initiative. And because it was appealing and because he was persuasive, people would go there and speak, and he had a pretty good group around him. I mean, so those kinds of local initiatives, local engagement, continuing to make the arguments, continuing to be public, finding allies, working together. I mean, all that's going to be really important.
So just to sum up, steel your spine, get ready for what's to come. Don't retreat. I do think right now there's the sense of that, maybe people should just withdraw from politics in the short run. It's too disruptive psychologically and personally, but actually people should lean in, not lean out right now. And then also something I've been an evangelist for a long time, increasing coalitions between the center right and the center left, because they actually have a lot more in common than they do with the extremes of their own parties, particularly in this sort of horseshoe moment where the far left and far right have animated the populism that's elevated this. Does that sound right to you?
I mean, that's absolutely true. So again, just to use Poland, it's an example that I know well. The coalition that eventually defeated the autocratic populists was three parties. It's kind of center left, center right, and center liberal, to be very general about it. And it was really the coming together of those different views that made it possible to create a new majority. And I think we will need something like that in the United States as well. I mean, the U.S. is so much bigger and more complicated, and each state has a different, different issues, and there may be things that you do in Ohio that you don't do in Florida. But generally speaking, I think that has to be eventually the formula.
One other thing you mentioned is various flavors of media capture, and I want to start with sort of the algorithmic impact on the election, which has, I think, if anything, been a little underanalyzed to date. There is one study I've seen from the University of Queensland that talked about algorithm shifts on X in the wake of Elon Musk's endorsement of Trump in July. Obviously, there's TikTok, which we will know in a few days whether it disappears under U.S. law or is given a new lease on life or is sold. But those algorithmic effects on our election, on our shared reality, they seem to be significant. Those are larger forces that are clearly disfiguring our ability to reason together using common facts. As you look at that algorithmic assault on democracy and the way in which some countries we've seen foreign powers quite explicitly try to undermine domestic democracies, what are some of the lessons there, some of the best practices or things you think we should look towards?
I mean, so one of the things that's about to happen is going to be an argument, or at least a discussion, between the US and Europe about how to treat what you've described as the algorithmic effects. I mean, I think it's a little bit bigger than social media. It's the social media plus a kind of network of podcasters and influencers. But it's pretty clear that the certainly X and probably TikTok, are and perhaps soon to be Facebook and Instagram as well. Although I have some caveats about all that. It's not so much that they're political one way or the other, although I think X probably is. It's that they are what goes viral on there are things that are not necessarily true, and so. There is no measure of knowing whether the video you've just seen on TikTok is based in reality or is completely made up. And I mean, most of it's not political, but then we also now have a new realm of, a new realm of politics where it's just sort of semi-political. For example, discussions of health and discussions of vaccines. There are areas of life where a lot of conspiracy theories are growing and somehow combine with kind of far right mysticism and some kind of far left mysticism as well. I just wrote a piece about this.
The Rasputin effect. Yes.
Which was published a few weeks ago. And so measuring the effect of that on TikTok or on X is impossible. But I think more broadly, measuring the effect of anything on social media is impossible. So we don't really know how these algorithms work. We don't really have a good insight into them. The platforms are not obligated to show us how their algorithms work or what they favor, or most watched videos or most read tweets. One of the things that's happening now in Europe is an argument that there should be regulation of the platforms, and a fundamental piece of that regulation should be transparency. So that whether it's vetted researchers who are allowed access to the algorithm or allowed to test and experiment to understand what's going on, or whether the companies are obliged to publish information about what people are looking or reading. There's a very hard push in Europe to do that. The European Union has actually already passed something called the Digital Services Act, which in theory allows them to enforce that transparency on the platforms.
How do they do that?
Well, I mean, just they force the platforms to obey the law. I mean, right now they haven't used the law yet. They're looking at using it. They require you give researchers access to the data, or you pay a fine. And that's we haven't gotten to that stage of the argument yet. I mean, the very interesting thing is, of course, an argument about greater transparency is really an argument in favor of free speech, because more information allows you to understand more about where you are and what you're seeing. You create better speech when you give people more, when the world they're operating in is less opaque. The Musk and his backers, J.D. Vance and others, have already started using this false idea. The Europeans are regulating us because they don't like free speech. This is, of course, this is the opposite of what's true. But you may see in the next few weeks and months a kind of clash between Europe, which may try to enforce its Digital Services Act, and the U.S., which is now going to resist it. That's an argument that's going to be had. That's something I'm writing about. Actually, that'll come out soon as well.
But
And
that's something.
So the question of whether we can have better social media, whether is not over. It just may be over for the moment in the United States.
Well, and there had been bills put forward 2 and 4 years ago that were bipartisan, that were steps towards what you just described. I think it's fair to say they're on ice now. Even the debate over COSA, the Child Online Safety Act, has been polarized among people who say that that's a free speech issue. But to your point, transparency is actually essential for free speech in the same way that competition is necessary for functioning capitalism. You need these sorts of guardrails in place. But there is this sort of radical coalition, these traditionalists, the radicals, that seem to benefit from or foment misinformation, and it's sticky, and that's part of what's sinister. The other piece that I think is worth highlighting, just looking at the Orban example, because again, Orban was praised at the Republican National Convention. It got very little attention because it's been so out there. But one of the things that Viktor Orban did in Hungary is, with his sort of oligarch plutocratic allies, had what is sometimes called media capture. They were able to purchase media outlets. In one case, one of the oldest papers was shuttered after someone bought it. In other cases, they were sort of folded into a nonprofit consortium, effectively controlled by the government. But at a time when there's a lot of distress in media, these things are not impossible to imagine. And so what's the counterweight to that, other than, patriotic people stepping up to ensure that independent press still exists?
So it's a very hard problem. It's also something that I didn't think would be possible in the U.S. because our system is too big. But now that I'm watching what's going on, I think, it is going to happen, or there will be an attempt to, of the wealthy people close to the administration will attempt to capture media or transform it the way Jeff Bezos seems intent on transforming the Washington Post, for example. Or you may see, the arms of the government acting against broadcasters or against media. The FCC and other regulatory bodies might be used to try to harm and damage independent media. That's also a possibility. I've been talking about this for a long time, actually, and almost any time I meet an American philanthropist who wants to know what they should do, I almost always tell them to go and buy a local newspaper and support it. They almost never want to do that. It's somehow unglamorous. They're afraid that it won't, it won't have the impact they want. I mean, but in my mind, it's one of the, investing in legitimate, fact-based local media, just even to produce the information that then people look at online. I mean, one of the things I'm worried about in the U.S. is, once there is no journalism in some part of the country, or in some industry or something, then there's really no information to be produced. If there's no journalism, if there's no information, then there can be no discussion or debate either. So if you have a problem, even if you have a natural disaster or calamity and there's nobody to write about it or nobody to examine it or nobody to explain what's happened, then how do you know how to fix it the next time or how to address the problem? And you begin to get the problem actually that you had at the end of the Soviet Union, which was that, the media and the national conversation was so heavily controlled that they couldn't fix themselves. As their system began to deteriorate, it wasn't possible to change it because no one could have an honest conversation about what was wrong. I don't think it's a problem for the whole country. And, I don't think the New York Times is going to go bankrupt. My magazine, The Atlantic, is doing really well. So it's not, we're not in that kind of dire circumstances. But you could have news deserts in some parts of the country, where there just isn't any information that's reliable about what's happening in local government or local business. And so then, I don't know, it's incumbent upon people who live in those places to support whatever media there is. There are a lot of new and interesting journalism projects, websites, al.com, for example, I wound up not writing about it, but I went to Birmingham, not some months ago and met some of the people working it. It's an Alabama website that used to be the Birmingham News and a couple of other Alabama newspapers. It's managed to be successful as a state-based news website, independent website. There are a few others. There's one in Mississippi. There are several others that I know of. So there are local websites, local attempts to create trustworthy news and organizations that are trying to build links with the community. I mean, if you're in a community like that, you should support it. You should subscribe to it. You should help it out. If you're in a position to help support it in a bigger way, you should do that. Of course, you should subscribe to whatever good news sources you have, and get other people to do it. The more fact-based, or at least fact-checked information that we have, the better. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. News organizations make errors, but there's just a difference between the ones who seek to correct the errors, at least some of the time, and those who are deliberately putting out false information, knowing that it's false and knowing that by putting out false information, they can get more clicks or more readers or more attention. And so it's really now, for citizens, it's now really important to make sure that you have thought a lot about where you're getting your information, and that you also think about how to support the sources that you think are good.
And to your point, one of the statistics about the election that most jumps out at me is that Trump won 88.5% of news deserts.
Yep.
And again, I just want to repeat that. He won 88.5% of news deserts. And news deserts do exist in the United States. And the extent we can have sort of patriotic philanthropy of people focusing on local news, because otherwise you do get sort of a situation that, among other things, is the civic conversation is all bread and circuses, and there's no one to cover corruption. And that's where I want to go next. One of the counter playbooks, it seems to me, is to raise awareness and indeed populist anger at not only ineffective and efficient government, but corruption. That corruption is something that seems to dislodge these forces, and it almost always goes with any sort of broad autocratic alliance. So I wonder what the lessons are about raising awareness and using corruption as a focus rather than some of the other things.
One of the effects of destroying checks and balances and weakening the media and weakening the judicial system, one of the immediate effects is that you get corruption, because people don't have any reason not to be, and that's true in really every autocratic country, and it's true in the deteriorating democracies like Hungary or Turkey. It's true in just across the board. It's even true in some American states, frankly. So yes, there is no question in my mind that there will be an enormous amount of corruption. Some of it will look like lobbyists getting jobs in the industries that they regulate, and then maintaining corrupt relationships with those industries. So some of it will be in the form of regulation. It's very important to watch whatever it is that Elon Musk is doing. This non-existent so far government department he's supposedly running. Even though it's not a government department. I mean, if he winds up writing regulations to benefit himself, that's about as close to an oligarchic system. I mean, it is an oligarchic system. And so focusing, making people aware of what's wrong with that and why it's bad and why it's damaging and why it affects you personally. One of the great corruption campaigners of all time was Alexei Navalny. Again, this is in a much more closed system than ours. This is the Russian dissident who was killed in a prison camp a few months ago. One of the things he was really good at was telling the story of corruption and then also explaining how it affects you. He would show he would connect the dots and show the palace that Putin had built with stolen money, or the schemes that some of his cronies were carrying out. And then he would explain, you don't have good roads, and you don't have good schools, and your hospital doesn't have supplies, and it's because of that. And he was very, very good at doing that. And there's something one could learn from him. I mean, there's something one can learn from the anti-corruption campaigning in Poland, even from the anti-corruption campaigning in Hungary, which hasn't succeeded yet. But to the extent that there is a coalescing narrative about Orban, it's about the money that he's stolen and the people around him whom he's enriched. and also the poverty that he's pushed his country. And one of the things that's not written enough about Hungary is that it's now one of the poorest countries in the European Union. And that's because its political system is so corrupt. So there is poverty is the result of corruption. Corruption makes you poor. And I think the more we can focus on following that as it develops and explaining it to people, the better.
I mean, I think in the search for silver linings, that center-right, center-left, fact-based coalition is now the opposition. It's not the establishment. And so you can kind of rail against the corruption that comes from a new establishment. And maybe that can animate people in a way that defending the status quo does not and cannot. I want to close by talking about the view from Europe and also specifically NATO. I mean, Joe Biden succeeded working in concert with our allies and expanding NATO, exactly the opposite outcome that Vladimir Putin presumably wanted when he invaded Ukraine. And lest we forget, Donald Trump not only has repeatedly threatened NATO under various pretexts and praised Vladimir Putin at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine, say it was a genius move, but he's also repeatedly floated and keeps getting drawn like a moth to a flame to the idea of weakening or undermining NATO, particularly threatening sort of the efficacy of Article 5. Now, from a European standpoint and from an American law standpoint, what are the checks that can be put on any attempts by him to undermine NATO, which is the most successful multilateral security organization in the history of the world?
To be honest, if Trump is very determined to discredit NATO, he can do it, and there isn't really anything that can stop him. I've now lost track of what happened to it. I mean, there are legal things the Senate can do to stop him from some kind of formal withdrawal from NATO. I mean,
and
that can be done.
They have passed that law. Yes,
they did pass it, right? So
Rubio, actually, the new Secretary of State, was instrumental in that.
I mean, there would be a huge amount of pressure from existing and former, generals and chairmen of the Joint Chiefs and so on. I mean, that would be a huge political thing to do, and I don't actually expect Trump to do that. I'm more worried about him undermining NATO through what he says, or through implications that NATO is now transactional, that Europe has to do X or Y if you want us to protect you. Mm-hmm. And that may even come into this issue we were talking about before. If Europe is going to regulate American media companies or American tech companies, then we won't protect you. I mean, it's more that kind of transactional way of talking about it that could undermine the sense of cohesion and could eventually, maybe not immediately, but eventually embolden the Russians to try and test NATO. What happens if we send some troops across the border into Estonia? What will you do? And that's more what I'm worried about. I mean, Europeans are very, very cautious right now about saying anything. I mean, nobody really knows what Trump's policy will be. He's given off very different kinds of signals, both when he talks to people privately and also when he talks in public. I think people were very thrown by this conversation about Greenland, which is a part of Denmark. And where the U.S. already has a military base, and where almost anything that the United States would like to do there, whether it's drilling for minerals or using shipping lanes or setting up, more bases, is possible now with the cooperation of the Danish government. And so nobody's quite sure why Trump started talking about Greenland as if he was going to invade it or occupy it, as if that was somehow necessary for American security. I mean, in the context of NATO, it's not necessary at all. We have all the access to Greenland that we need. The question of whether it's really all that important is leave it aside for the moment.
Do you think, though, that this is a distraction or some sort of lurch towards great power politics on the back of a napkin, or do you think it's something
honestly,
more sinister?
To be really honest, I don't know. I don't know why he did it. I don't know why he's talking. I mean, of course, it wasn't just Greenland; it was Canada and Panama and so on. I don't know who's around him, who's giving him those ideas. I don't know whether this is some kind of burst of 19th century, even kind of Putinist imperialism, these are all fake countries, or whether he just said that to create drama and he'll forget about it next week. I really don't know. I mean, we'll see.
So in this struggle, the defining struggle of our times, which you've chronicled, and paraphrasing Joe Biden there, which is between democracy and autocracy, obviously autocracies have tried to undermine liberal democracies and using disinformation and misinformation to weaken from within. At the same time, we have seen Assad fall suddenly. We've seen Iran be increasingly isolated. We've seen the Russian regime be exposed as being more brittle, lest we forget they thought they would take Ukraine and were half of it in a few days. Venezuela, Maduro seems to have stolen an election, but even that regime is more rickety. And to your point, in the spirit of keeping hope alive, nothing is done. This too shall pass. So how do you see that balance right now and the opportunities for democracies to play offense? Maybe not with American leadership at the moment, but with the alliances that have been built and given the inherent inefficiencies of autocracies.
Yeah. So as my other recent book, which was Autocracy Inc., is a description of how the autocracies have begun to work together. Yes. Partly, and part of the reason they do so, there's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Belarus, Nicaragua, Cuba, so on. One of the reasons that they do work together is because they are all aware that the narrative, not just of democracy, but the narrative of justice, the desire that people have to live in a system where they have some rights, where they have real courts, where they have real information, is, you don't have to make people read John Stuart Mill or teach them the history of, the American Revolution. I mean, people intuitively want those things, even in places where they've never had them. And because the autocracies are aware of that, that's one of the reasons they've begun working together and supporting one another in new ways, in ways they didn't used to do. And so that's true. But all of them have this, there is an inherent, there is an inherent weakness, which is that there will always be people who want something different. There will always be people who experience injustice and are radicalized by it. I mean, a lot of the greatest and most notable, kind of dissidents in the autocratic world now are people who were not necessarily born into politics. And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's the effective right now leader of the Belarusian opposition, was a housewife who was radicalized, who became political after the arrest of her husband. Maria Corina Machado, I mean, maybe she's a little bit different. She's somebody who's been in politics for a long time, but she's also somebody who in a different system and in a different world might have gone a different way, but was so moved by what was happening in her country to begin calling for democracy and calling for free elections. So there's something that happens to people. They get drawn to politics, when they feel injustice, and that's one of the things that will always make those regimes susceptible. The other thing that will always make them susceptible is the fact that the enforcers of the regime, the security services, the army, whoever it is in a given country, whoever is using firepower against citizens, they're also part of the country. They have cousins and relatives and friends who are also victims, and sometimes are victims of corruption or they're victims of repression. And the moment that those people start to feel that the system is weak or that it won't protect them, they do sometimes switch sides. That seems to be, in effect, what happened in Syria, for example. That it wasn't that the this kind of rebel army stormed the capital and won these brilliant battles. It was that the Syrian army stopped fighting and gave up. And that's something that can happen in many of these regimes in a surprising way. And that's why sometimes the fall of these regimes is very quick and unexpected.
Your perspective is invaluable. And while you have been predicting the storm clouds that are upon us, I hope what people take from this conversation is now's the time for citizens to stay strong, to straighten your civic backbone, to keep the faith, not to give up the good fight, to defend democracy at home and abroad. Anne Applebaum, thank you for all you do, and thanks for joining us on How to Fix It.
Thank you.